Douglas McGregor has been part of this, apparatus, and he arguably still is a part of it, just in a different capacity now, more of an information capacity. But he has gone against what is probably the majority position. Actually, it is the majority position in the Pentagon, in the intelligence agencies, which is move forward with aggression toward China around Taiwan, move forward with aggression toward Russia in Ukraine. And he's gone against both of that. So I do give him definitely a lot of credit for that. But let's begin with the with what he had to say here. I'm gonna skip Clayton Morris's question. Basically, the first 2 minutes, all they spoke about was, how the U.S. really, how China really isn't building up, that there is no coming invasion. So back in November, you had the Biden administration with this rhetoric that, oh, we need to prepare to defend Taiwan because any minute now China could invade. Douglas McGregor basically said no. And then Clayton Morris, he basically said, no, there's nothing militarily that you could observe to prove that. So Biden, Western media lying. Then Clayton Morris is asking, well, then where does all this rhetoric come from? And I think that's a good place to start with this analysis. So here we go.
So why now? I mean, I know you're not a politician, but what's your sense of why are we hearing all of this rhetoric right now?
Well, I might also add that I recently listened to John Bolton come out and describe China as the great existential threat of our era. And I wasn't present for his statement, but if I had been there, I would have said, well, what happened to the global caliphate? Right. I thought the global caliphate was the existential threat of our era. What did it go away? I think a lot of this is grossly exaggerated. The president of Taiwan is in trouble politically. There are two parties that are meaningful and powerful that govern Taiwan from time to time. One is.
So before I move on, I just want to say he was right there. The DPP was in trouble politically. They recently lost before the new year. They lost major local elections. All of the big municipalities, including Taipei, are now under KMT control. And Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, the president of the authority of Taiwan, had to resign, and she is just going to carry out her term until the next presidential election, and then they will probably have to choose another. They'll have to choose another candidate, and they're likely not going to do too well in the general election, given the sweep in the local. But let's continue.
The KMT. And the other is the Democratic Progressive Party, which is led by the current president. The DPP, which is the current party in power, has always been very pro-Japanese. People need to understand that Taiwan was ruled by Japan for quite a while. The people on Taiwan, however, thrived under the Japanese. And the Japanese have worked very hard to help industrialize and modernize industry on Taiwan, just as they did in South Korea. We never bring.
So before we go on, this is where I will not agree with Douglas McGregor. I do not agree with Douglas McGregor on the position that Japan was a progressive force for Taiwan and for South Korea. There was brutal exploitation of the peasantry and of the indigenous in Taiwan, especially under the colonial regime of Japan, 1895 to 1945, and in Korea, a little bit after that, I believe, until the same period. It was more than 40 years. So let's not – I wanted to play that just so you get the sense of where Douglas McGregor comes from politically and how this is a popular narrative, right, that, okay, well, there might have been problems with colonialism. It wasn't all bad because these countries got to advance. And I'm not going to argue that Taiwan's industrial base does have Japanese features to it. There's no doubt about that. But we also have to understand that came at incredible costs that led to war, led to anti-colonial movements, and that eventually led to their ouster. And so it wasn't so popular, so to speak, with the people. But let's continue.
Bring these kinds of things up, but Japan's presence everywhere was not, quote unquote, inherently evil. from the standpoint of the people that lived there and lived under Japanese rule. And that was particularly true for Taiwan. So that's one party. And that's the party that has talked for years, decades, about independence from China. However, whenever they have walked up to the abyss, in other words, to look just to the cliff edge of independence, they realized that that was a red line that could not be crossed, because if you cross that red line, you will end up at war with mainland China. That's been made very clear repeatedly. We've always understood that, which is why we adopted the one China policy that we did, not because we wanted to harm Taiwan. On the contrary, we were trying to protect it, make it abundantly clear that we were not going to make Taiwan a threat to the mainland.
So this is, of course, not the correct interpretation of history. Douglas McGregor is correct that U.S. military officials, even during the normalization period with China, definitely wanted some to participate in some kind of agreement with China around Taiwan, but not because they wanted to protect Taiwan, but because they had to if they were going to normalize relations with China. This was a red line, as Douglas McGregor said. There would be no normalization process between China and the United States back in the early 1970s, right? Completing in 1979, but beginning with Nixon's visit in 72. That wouldn't have happened if the U.S. didn't agree to talk with China over Taiwan, because there have been two Taiwan Straits crises that the United States facilitated. The United States almost nuked China, threatened to nuclear warfare on China over the Taiwan Straits, over protecting and then trying to empower the KMT to take back power in mainland China. That didn't happen. Taiwan was called Formosa at that time. The PLA just obliterated. The KMT could not fight anymore. By the time that the Taiwan Straits crisis happened, I believe it was 1950, and the 1958. PLA just was the most popular party in, the Communist Party was the most popular party in China, and the PLA was what the people supported. They didn't support the KMT anymore. So this is not the correct history, but it is important to understand that, yes, there was a red line, but that red line was China's red line. The United States almost went beyond that red line during the period that Colonel McGregor is talking about. So just some clarification there. Let's continue.
That's red line number one. That hasn't changed, but she is in political trouble. You have to understand that whenever there are major elections in that country, one party wins by a point or two over the other. So the KMT, which is Chiang Kai-shek's old party, is breathing down her neck. And the KMT, Clayton, wants unification with the mainland. That's what we don't understand. So you're talking about 50% of the electorate on Taiwan has sided with the DPP and this eventual independence, and the other 50% says, oh no, we want reunification with the mainland. Well, people find that hard to understand. Well, things have changed on the mainland.
So before we get to this, because this is the meat about China that we need to correct, it's more complicated than that. It's not just that there's 50-50. People want independence in Taiwan. People want status quo, one China principle. It's not that simple. Actually, there are various ideas and opinions that lean one way or the other. So I think there's only a tiny minority who are fervently pro-independence, who are behind basically everything that Tsai Ing-wen says. There's probably a larger group, although still I think the minority, who want independence at some point but are okay with the status quo for now, given how complicated things are. And then there are others, I think the majority, that are at some level in favor of the status quo or the one China principle. From those who are very impassioned, we're talking about KMT loyalists and those who are in the authorities of that political party, to even those who kind of straddle the line of the DPP's maybe other political orientation and policies and positions on other issues. And they might believe that, okay, we want the status quo, but we're willing to listen to some kind of independence forever. Or just, we don't believe in independence, but one China principle, we're not as passionate about it maybe as that. But the majority sit somewhere in the status quo. So it's even more complicated. I wouldn't say that you could put 50-50 and that only a couple of votes will determine. I think more goes into why elections swing the way they do in Taiwan. I think that domestic priorities in Taiwan, given that they have so much autonomy, which is not talked about at all, but they have so much autonomy in Taiwan that the DPP, this local election, for example, lost by such a large margin because Tsai Ing-wen promoted anti-China rhetoric while not being able to explain, hey, we're selling off TSMC, the semiconductor monopoly that basically is the majority of the economy in Taiwan. We're selling that off to the United States, deindustrializing, outsourcing to the United States. That's going to hurt Taiwan. There's already been economic issues, inflation, that sort of thing. And none of that was addressed. And so the DPP paid for it in the electoral arena, and they're probably going to pay for in the local elections, but they're probably going to pay for it even more in the general and the presidential should this continue. And there's other issues too, like the way the DPP just kind of opened up so much to foreign capital to the point where you had like certain chemicals and meats and pork products and stuff come into the country. Come into Taiwan, which is not a country. It's part of China, but it came into Taiwan, and there was a lot of fighting about that, allowing this kind of processed pork in, which is very harmful to health. So there were other domestic issues that definitely played a role, but nevertheless, it's a little more complicated than saying it's 50-50 and only a couple of points will determine it. This local election showed that that's not necessarily the case, that it can be definitely a much wider margin, but that there are just there's a big range within these two positions of independence and status quo, one China principle. There's variation in it, but most people, this is why it's kind of suicidal to even think about trying to wage some kind of military operation from Taiwan at this moment. Most people are leaning toward the status quo still. So if you wage a military operation with conditions like that, well, it's probably going to be a very quick ending for the United States. But let's continue.
You have instead of two radically different systems, actually speaking, they've moved closer to each other because the Taiwanese system has always been very authoritarian. Today, the mainland Chinese system is authoritarian, but it is no longer totalitarian as it was under Mao. This is not Maoist China. There are no real communists left in China. They're capitalists, but they're state capitalists. That's what we normally associate with hard fascism. Both of them.
So let me just break this down a little bit. And I want to listen to more so we get through the first, I think it's like 12 minutes I want to play. But I have to respond to that assertion. So to say that there's no communists in China is, I don't know, I guess 96 million people that are part of the Communist Party of China think of themselves as something else. And I think it's quite interesting that he uses the term authoritarian for Taiwan as well, because Taiwan actually, in a lot of ways, has tried to mirror a more free market system, economic system. But at the same time, it does have a lot of state intervention. You could ponder the reasons why that was, but I think there are two major reasons. One, the fact that mainland China has a very command economy. It has a very centralized economy where you have a market system that's allowed to flourish, but under the direction and supervision of a centralized socialist governance system. This is the language that China uses. If you don't agree it's socialist or it's not this or not that, nonetheless, this is how it works in China. And so what I find interesting is that he kind of equates the two as almost equal. And I think that that's false in a lot of ways. I think that Taiwan is definitely more laissez-faire, or definitely more open to the market. But I think the state intervention in Taiwan's economy is, one, because of the influence of China. There's definitely, first of all, a lot of coordination and cooperation between Taiwan and China for obvious reasons. But also there's more to it than that. It's the fact that, during World War II, Taiwan, Formosa, or whatever what you want to call it, had just experienced so much colonialism, poverty, etc., that the KMT really did need, for their own political legitimacy after committing massacres, martial law, they did put through a more state kind of oriented economy to develop it in order to, in order to maintain some kind of legitimacy. Because for 30 years, Chiang Kai-shek was saying, well, it was like 22 years, Chiang Kai-shek was saying without any objection from the United States that he was still the leader of China, right? So you had the KMT still saying they were mainland China. And so they were trying to put together some kind of economy to maintain legitimacy of some kind, despite the massacres, despite the brutality that existed under KMT Taiwan during the martial law period. Despite all of that, you did have state intervention in the economy. But to call that authoritarian, I think, is just interesting. It just shows where Douglas McGregor comes from. But to equate either of them with fascism is ridiculous, in my opinion. And also to say that they're the same and to say that there's no communists in China, well, I don't think many Chinese people would agree with that, especially in this moment where the leadership of the Communist Party has only grown in legitimacy. And that is not because they've become more fascistic and capitalistic, like Douglas McGregor is saying here. But let's continue.
Those states, the people that live in those states, the rulers of those states, have a very similar goal. That goal is to eventually become like Singapore. Now, this is hard for Americans to understand, but Singapore is what the Chinese in Taiwan and the Chinese on the mainland both want. Now,
Right.
Why do they want to live in Singapore? Well, Singapore is this thriving financial center, economic metropolis. There's absolute enforcement of the rule of law to the point where most of us would find it stifling and insufferable, but that's completely consistent with Confucian culture and the Chinese mentality. They don't care who governs as long as the government provides for security and enables everyone who lives in that country to earn a good living, to enjoy prosperity and improve themselves. It's a very different world from the one that you and I live in. They both want that. You have 1 million Taiwanese citizens every day working and living on the mainland. Every time there is a major crisis internationally of any kind over the last 30 years, the banks in Taiwan have moved most of their capital to the mainland, where they think it's going to be safer. The bottom line, Clayton, is there is not going to be a war between China and Taiwan unless two red lines are crossed. One, Declaration of Independence, unambiguous from the government of Taiwan. We are now independent. We do not recognize the mainland as as the governing legitimate authority here or anywhere else for China. We are it. Number two, we are now going to station U.S. forces or Japanese forces or both on Taiwan. That's red line number two. If either of those things happen, no question about it, China will mobilize, millions of troops will show up, ships will show up, there will be war, even if it results in the destruction of Taiwan. And that's because all through World War II, stretching all the way back into the 30s to 1934, 35, 36, 37, every military intervention, incursion, and ultimately invasion by the Imperial Japan of China was staged on Taiwan. Taiwan was Japan's unsinkable aircraft carrier. Now, when we sell weapons.
So I want to just stop it there before we continue, because what's so interesting about this, right? This idea that China and Taiwan are the same and they're moving in similar paths. Actually, the leadership in China, the Communist Party of China, would say that there is more integration and that China has opened up and that China has tried to integrate itself and done a good job of integrating itself in the global economy. And therefore, there would be much more opportunities for integration, even between its own territories like Taiwan and the mainland, for example. And so Chinese leadership probably wouldn't argue with that. But to then say that it's because they're not socialists, which of course many people in China, especially leaders and officials in China, would disagree with. Socialism has become, I think, an even more integral part of how China talks about itself and how a lot of Chinese people talk about their country especially because of the increasing conflict happening between the United States, a collective West, against China and with China. But I think it just shows profound misunderstanding to say that China wants to be like Singapore. Taiwan authorities and what the DPP wants, that's a whole other story. Taiwan did embrace, because of the KMT's leadership. KMT was not a socialist organization or party. It's a capitalist party. It wanted to be more like the West. I'm not going to argue that kind of a more neoliberal model like Singapore that is more state interventionist would be something that maybe political forces in Taiwan would think about. But to claim China, the second biggest economy in the world, GDP-wise, biggest in terms of purchasing power parity, and has since 1949 only championed a socialist governance system and only championed opening up and reform under the auspices of socialist government control, and the leadership of the party. Not once in the history of China since the revolution of 1949 has the Communist Party of China even had a moment like the Soviet Union with the secret speech during Khrushchev, where there was undermining of the Communist Party of China. There's no Gorbachev moments. There was none of that. No Gorbachev-Yeltsin moments in China. There's always been a strong Communist Party. So to think that this Communist Party, which just had its 20th National Congress right during this conversation, actually, that Douglas McGregor had with Clayton Morris, to read into that Congress and what came out of it as some kind of, well, we're going the Singapore model route, I think is a profound misunderstanding of where China is going. China is not only integrating and opening up more, but it's also focusing inward on its modernization with socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's not Singapore. And if you've been to China or you understand China, you would see that if you were to go to Singapore and then go to China, you would see two very different societies. Some similarities, of course, because of the way that Asia as a whole is developing and integrating more and more, but you would see a lot of differences, especially in the way that the Communist Party has profound influence over social, cultural life, but also in how there are certain aspects of the economy that are geared toward people's needs that you wouldn't find in a Singapore or a South Korea, right? You find way more state intervention and way more just overall people-centered development. And that's what China would argue. I would argue that as well, that there's more people-centered development in China. It's why China has eradicated extreme poverty, and why Singapore, why South Korea, why they have not. Okay, that's the big difference between these two countries, or between those countries. But let's continue. Let's finish up. I think there's about 4 or 5 minutes left. I'm going to play a bit longer and then respond after that.
Happens to Taiwan. We used to be very careful about what we sold to ensure that they were, quote unquote, for purely defensive purposes. But recently, some of our decisions about missiles and missile technology and radars have raised eyebrows in Beijing, because they look at the arrival of weapon systems and say, oh, those aren't really defensive. Those are being pre-positioned for use by U.S. forces, so that U.S. forces could come into Taiwan and man these in a conflict or crisis. Now, I don't think that's really the case yet, but that alerts people to the mentality in Beijing and what they fear. And what they fear is us, U.S. military, on Taiwan in any capacity, more than anything else.
So that's red line number 2. Does that seem, I mean, it seems like from the Biden administration, we heard Anthony Blinken just a few weeks ago saying that China wants to seize Taiwan on a faster timeline. So you're hearing this rhetoric from the Biden administration. You're hearing it from Republicans as well as Democrats. And you were right. You were totally prescient the other day before this election saying, Clayton, I don't see after this election much change at all. And in fact, you were right about that. Now we've got total gridlock in Washington, and both parties are in simpatico on this China question. So do you think that the United States would dare to cross that red line? Does that seem like something you're starting to hear or see? If that's the only way that they're going to go to war, then that would be the way that they're moving. It seems like you hear Antony Blinken talk about this and these other guys in the Biden administration pushing for that.
Well, the first answer that springs to mind is no. I don't see that we are planning to do that. No. If we are, I'm unaware of it. Would we do that? As I said, I think that would be extremely foolhardy and unnecessary. I don't think that this administration, whatever we think of it, and I don't hold it in very high esteem, is that stupid. So I don't see us doing that. What we do see are a couple of things. First of all, you talked about the aircraft, the Chinese aircraft. If you look at the Air Defense Identification Zone, what we call the ADIZ, that reaches out and touches Taiwan. In other words, if you're sitting in China, you have this thing called the Air Defense Identification Zone, which requires everyone who flies into it to identify themselves. It doesn't say you have to land. It doesn't say you can't come in. It's just if you fly in, you must identify yourself. That zone skirts or incorporates some of Taiwan as part of their early warning system. We have an air defense identification zone that extends 1,000 miles into the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
That extends right up to the border with Russia, practically in the Bering Strait around Alaska. We all the nations have these things, and the great powers are extremely sensitive to them. If someone flies in from Chinese or Russian air forces, violates that ADIZ and doesn't announce themselves and make it clear that this is not hostile, we scramble aircraft, send them into the air. They do the same thing. And whenever we send ships through the Taiwan Strait, which we just did, the Chinese shake their heads and like, oh, stupid, send up 150 jets and make it clear that this is not what we want. And by the way, we usually get a message from the Taiwanese Ministry of Defense that says, would you mind not doing that anymore? Because every time you do that, the Chinese on the mainland send up aircraft and raise hell with us. Now, last point on this, it's very important. We just had this party congress. Right. Everyone is talking about Xi.
So I don't really want to play this aspect of it, but I will play just a little bit of it. All right. But I do want to talk about what he's saying here, which I do think is not out of just complete left field. Like, I don't think he is wrong in a lot of cases here. One thing that I think he mistakenly said, though, is that he said the ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, hits Taiwan. I think he was talking about Taiwan's so-called Air Defense Identification Zone, which was created by the United States and actually extends into Fujian province in mainland China. I think he got his words a little twisted, because what he was describing was how that air defense identification zone actually goes into mainland China and actually therefore causes some problems. And so all of these provocations by the United States, it ends up kind of blowing back on Taiwan, and the Chinese mainland, the PLA responds in some kind of way. That's not untrue. That is very true. But at the same time, on the one hand, he's calling for that to be rolled back. I think that's fair. I don't think that this should be happening. But at the same time, he's about to get into a point here, which I think almost contradicts what he's saying, or at least it provides unnecessary analysis, which I don't think doesn't comport. It doesn't really align with reality. So I'm just going to let him speak for a little bit longer and then end this. Hold on.
Oh, he's now more powerful than Mao was, and so forth, so on. Clayton, that's not an accident. The Chinese ruling elite, which is really what the Communist Party is now, it's just a party elite that rules the country. Stop thinking of them as communists and just thinking of them as a standard fascist elite party. They're afraid. They are afraid of economic disaster inside of China. We could sit here and run through all the bubbles that are bursting in China. The first one, of course, is the real estate bubble, which I'm sure you've heard about and others have.
Yeah, we've covered it on the show. It's potentially a disaster, right?
The Chinese fear that they will wake up and discover that in addition to lots of cities with no one living in them, that there will be tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people who can't find work, who have no employment. They know from history there are two things that get you into trouble in China in terms of what we call dynastic change events, when the government is overthrown and a new one walks in. One is starvation. If you can't feed the population, you're done. Every emperor who failed to feed the population, who had a problem with plagues or starvation, was done right away. If you can't employ people, if the economy seizes up and stops, and China is no longer the big agrarian power that it once was, it's got a very small agricultural sector compared with what it formerly had, because it has many, many more people and very, very little arable land.
All right. So that's all we need to listen to. All right. So I wanted to play just that little bit more because this is a very popular understanding of China in this moment, that while, I have no problems with Douglas McGregor speaking out against what is counterproductive military provocations by the United States, or his assertion that there isn't going to be a war between China and the United States over Taiwan, given how much integration there is between China and Taiwan, and given how, the United States is at a complete disadvantage. And it would be at a big disadvantage. But the problem here is that he's now trying to talk about China and the Chinese side of things in a way that I think just distorts reality. For one, China is not scared. He said China is not a big agricultural power anymore. Sure, it is not just some kind of big, massive countryside that is extremely poor and does subsistence farming and, often fails because it doesn't have the technology to do it. No, China has mechanized agriculture to the point where actually it has been able to cut back a lot on how much it relies on agriculture for its overall stability in economic terms. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that China is weak. China, doesn't have a lot of arable land, so it doesn't make sense to be an agricultural centered economy. But at the same time, but what's happened actually in China is it's become more stable because it has a very diverse manufacturing centered economy that has a central bank in a state that's mostly state owned and government controlled, that has the ability to manage finances in a way that is planned and that can move through shocks and different issues in the world economy and also continue to go forward on certain objectives. So China is not scared of this. There's no, I don't know where this fear, there's at this time, I remember there was a lot about the real estate bubble supposedly in China that never came to fruition. There's always another bubble, another crisis in China. There's always some coming collapse. Gordon Chang, right, always talks about that on places like Fox News. There's always something, but it never comes to be. And even with this COVID reopening, China, yes, is thinking about the economy. It wants to grow its economy. But was it scared that its economy was going to collapse because of COVID-19 protections and restrictions and zero COVID? Not really, because its economy hadn't collapsed. It had become smaller. It certainly wanted more growth. But you will hear from Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping, you will hear from what the Communist Party says and what the Chinese government says, especially over the last year and a half, that actually China is focused more on quality growth now. That it's not all about just let's get 10% per year GDP growth year on year. Let's do that every single year. No, it's not really about that anymore. It's about, well, what is that growth doing for China? What is that growth doing for the world? There's a lot more of that kind of consideration now. So no, China is not fearful of hunger. Hunger is not a big issue. If it's an issue at all in China, you don't hear about that very often anyway, because, well, it just doesn't exist so much. A country that's been able to eradicate extreme poverty means that it's been able to largely eradicate hunger. That doesn't mean that relative poverty doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that people still don't struggle in China, but it does mean that hunger as an issue largely has been eradicated. Unemployment, there's some unemployment in China, I think it hovers between 2 to 6%, right, on its worst, in terms of its worst numbers. But the employment situation is very fluid and dynamic in China, given that they still have a lot of interchange and interplay between the cities and the countryside. That you do have a lot of this, what they call migrant labor, but really it's people living in the countryside, coming to work in the cities, not having residencies in the cities. So they make a lot of money or a good amount of money temporarily. Then they go back at certain periods of time. And there's that kind of back and forth that happens. And that's a contradiction that China still is working through. But at the same time, wages consistently grow in China, and job growth is pretty robust in China. There isn't a lot of worry about that. The worry was that the shockwaves in the world economy would mean that China would maybe be diverted a bit from its overall goals. There are concerns about that for sure. And you don't have to listen to me. You can just read what China has to say about that. That's just something that is understandably a concern. I think it's a concern for most countries in the world. But there really is no catastrophe on the horizon. And that's why China is not really taking the bait over the Taiwan question. It's why China is kind of, I had Brian Berletic on the show. He's right. China is kind of just waiting this thing out and will respond in kind to aggression when these, like Colonel Douglas McGregor said, when warships are sailed through the Taiwan Straits, when there are provocations, China will respond, but it's not going to be an overreaction. You'll never see that from China. We learned our lesson during the Pelosi visit. China's not going to overreact because it doesn't have to. International law is on China's side. The U.S. and China's own agreements are on China's side. A lot of agreements with European and collective West countries on China's side. All of the politics of this issue are on China's side. It's just a matter of whether the United States will do something so incredibly unproductive that would shake up the world to a much larger degree than even what Ukraine has. Will the United States, will the collective West follow the U.S. down that path? That's a question that I think is a little more ambiguous. I wouldn't say that Colonel Douglas McGregor is 100%, we can say 100% he's correct. There will be no war. I'm not going to say that. I learned my lesson from the Ukraine proxy war. But nonetheless, the truth is that Colonel Douglas McGregor had a lot of good things to say, I think, about how the military situation really is, right? The military situation is, or at least the political context for the military situation is not favorable to the United States. So the United States probably shouldn't continue its provocations. But where Douglas McGregor shows that he is part of this more partisan establishment apparatus, where he does have leanings to one section of the political elite versus the other, is when he starts talking about Chinese history, when he starts talking about Chinese politics. That's where things get more muddled, and where you see that this is more of a strategic disagreement than it really is a political disagreement with the Biden administration. Douglas McGregor isn't saying that China is a threat and that we shouldn't be doing anything with China. It's that this way of going about it is not the right way. And I can't disagree with that element of it, that, building up aggressively militarily with Taiwan is not great and it should be stopped. It should be. We shouldn't be, the United States should not be going down that path because it doesn't benefit anybody but warmongers and military contractors and neocons. But at the same time, we still have to correct the record on China because it's not good enough to just oppose that. Because what happens when the tactics change? The empire doesn't rest. It's not like if Taiwan is a flashpoint for a larger campaign against China, and we need to speak up and speak out against the entire thing. And that means understanding China more robustly and understanding China in a way that helps inform our understanding of the entire geopolitical situation and why the United States is doing this. The United States isn't trying to protect Taiwan. It doesn't care about democracy. It doesn't care about the South China Sea. It doesn't care about Chinese people, Chinese workers. It doesn't care about any of that. It cares about hegemony. It cares about empire. It cares about how can it obliterate and conduct regime change in China so that it can gobble up the Chinese market. It doesn't just want access to the Chinese market. China is opened up. China will do foreign direct investment with any country. And the United States and China have huge economic relationship, a huge economic relationship. It's one of the biggest in the world. But it doesn't just want that. It wants U.S. corporations, monopolies to control the Chinese market. And I've covered things like the high-speed rail industry, how it's state-owned in China, and how the United States has hated that. The United States wants that to end. It wants all of China's state-owned industries to be privatized, and it wants to sell off all of China's assets in order to enrich big monopolies, big tech corporations, big banks, the big Wall Street, all of it. That's the ultimate plan. That's the ultimate goal. It's just a matter of how do we get there. And Douglas McGregor, you can tell Douglas McGregor is very much about free market. Every kind of state intervention is bad. And so there's a strategic difference here. And what's interesting about this moment is that you have people like Douglas McGregor speaking about the military aspect of Ukraine and Taiwan in a manner that does push against the overall trajectory of the collective West and the empire, the American empire.